Putin's regime falling apart, oligarchs flee Russia amid chaos. Tonight, what we are witnessing is not just the unraveling of a political system. It is the extraordinary collapse of an empire built on fear, oligarchic loyalty, and the illusion of permanence. Because when the billionaires who prop up a regime start fleeing that regime, when the money that kept the machinery running suddenly finds the exits, the world takes notice. What we are seeing now is something as haunting as it is historic. Imagine this scene. Private jets departing Moscow's Vnukovo airport in the dead of night, their flight plans filed to Dubai, Istanbul, Tel Aviv. Luxury yachts leaving Russian waters under cover of darkness. Bank accounts quietly shifting from rubles to dollars, from Moscow to Geneva, from certainty to desperate preservation. This is not speculation. This is happening right now, documented by flight tracking data and maritime surveillance. Think about that. These are not dissidents or opposition voices who always feared the knock on the door. These are the insiders, the architects, the beneficiaries of Putin's system. Men like Roman Abramovich, Mikhail Fridman, Oleg Deripaska. And yet, in recent weeks, something fundamental has shifted. The confidence has evaporated. The assurances have proven hollow. Here's the first hook. For nearly 3 years, the world has watched Russia wage war on Ukraine, devastating cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut, targeting civilians, projecting an image of unstoppable force. But tonight, as oligarchs flee, as the elite class fractures, as the very foundation of Putin's regime shows cracks that cannot be hidden, we are witnessing something extraordinary. The collapse is not coming from outside pressure alone, it is coming from within. This is not just another headline about sanctions or economic decline. It is about the moment when loyalty becomes liability, when proximity to power becomes proximity to danger, when those who built the throne start fleeing the palace. History teaches us one undeniable truth: the regime is crumbling. And that crumbling, that haunting exodus of billionaires in the night, may be the most significant turning point in this entire conflict. The system is eating itself, and the world is watching it happen in real time. For centuries, the pattern has been the same. When empires begin to crumble, the first to sense it are the elites, those closest to power. From Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, when his marshals began questioning the emperor's judgment, to Hitler's final days in the bunker as officers plotted escape routes, the story is always the same. Dictators project strength until suddenly they cannot. And when the projection fails, those who enabled the dictator recognize their fates are no longer tied to his success. Napoleon believed his empire was invincible until the Russian winter proved otherwise. Hitler's inner circle spent final weeks planning exit. Strategies, fake identities, routes to Argentina. These were moments when mythology was born, not of conquest, but of collapse. And now, in 2025, that mythology is not history. It is playing out in real time across Russia. For nearly 3 years, Russia's war on Ukraine has played out as brutal aggression. Cities reduced to rubble, power grids systematically destroyed, leaving millions in freezing darkness. Hospitals bombed, schools obliterated. The Kremlin wanted to project dominance, to show the world that Russia could wage war without consequence. But behind that projection, another story was unfolding. The economy began straining under Western sanctions. Companies like McDonald's, IKEA, and Volkswagen pulled out, taking jobs and legitimacy. The ruble fluctuated wildly. Inflation crept higher, officially 15%, but realistically closer to 25% for basic goods. Supply chains fractured, and yet, for the oligarchs, there was still comfort. Their wealth was offshore. Their children lived in London and Paris. They believed they were insulated. And yet, something changed in late 2024. The war that was supposed to last weeks stretched into its 3rd year. Ukrainian forces began striking back, not just at military targets, but at symbols of Russian power. Drone strikes hit oil refineries in Tatarstan, 800 miles from the front. Explosions rocked the Savazlika airbase near Nizhny Novgorod. And then came the most symbolic strike. Moscow itself went dark when Ukrainian drones pierced Russian airspace on January 7, 2025. That moment was more than tactical victory. It was psychological earthquake. For the first time, the war was not over there. It was here. The oligarchs felt something they had not felt before: vulnerability. The illusion that Moscow was untouchable shattered in an instant. Reports began surfacing of private meetings, Hushed conversations in exclusive clubs, encrypted messages between billionaires and their lawyers. The question was no longer how to profit from the regime. The question was how to survive its collapse. Because for all the propaganda, the insiders knew the truth. The war was unsustainable. The economy was buckling. And most haunting, the leader they had supported for decades was becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, increasingly dangerous. Let's be honest. Putin's regime has never been about ideology. It has been about control and enrichment among a small elite. The oligarchs were not passive beneficiaries. They enabled the corruption, legitimized the authoritarianism, stood silent while journalists like Anna Politkovskaya were murdered, while opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny were poisoned. But here's the truth. The system that enriched them has now become the system that threatens them. You cannot build an empire on lies and expect it to stand forever. You cannot suppress freedom, jail critics, invade neighbors, and claim to defend sovereignty. The hypocrisy is staggering. And yet, for years, the oligarchs tolerated it, profited from it. They traded integrity for yachts and palaces. They believed that as long as they remained loyal, they would be safe. And yet, now, as the regime fractures, that safety is revealed as illusion. In a system built on fear, no one is truly safe. There's a misconception spreading that oligarchs fleeing Russia are simply reacting to Western sanctions, but that misses the point entirely. What is happening is calculated self-preservation by people with access to information the rest of us do not have. These are individuals with private intelligence networks, with connections inside the Kremlin, with the ability to see the trajectory of Putin's regime in ways ordinary citizens cannot. Flight tracking data from January 2025 shows a 23% increase in private jet departures from Russia compared to the same period last year. Maritime tracking reveals that at least 11 luxury yachts, each worth over $100 million, have left Russian ports since December. These are not vacations, these are exits. Here's the second hook. What makes this extraordinary is the speed and the silence. Men who once appeared at state events, who posed for photographs with Putin, who spoke publicly about loyalty, are now disappearing without explanation. Roman Abramovich's yacht, Luna, was spotted off the coast of Montenegro on January 20th. Mikhail Fridman reportedly relocated to London in December. Oleg Deripaska's private jet made 3 trips to Dubai in 2 weeks. Intelligence agencies across Europe and the United States have been tracking these movements closely. According to sources familiar with classified assessments, several oligarchs have reached out through intermediaries to Western governments, offering information in exchange for protection. They are not seeking asylum traditionally. They are seeking insurance. Insurance that if the regime collapses, if Putin falls, their assets will not be seized. Think about that. These are men who spent decades building fortunes through corruption, through state-sanctioned theft. And yet now, facing collapse, they are turning to the very Western governments they once denounced. The irony is almost poetic. What many don't realize is this exodus follows a pattern. The first to leave were those with least direct ties to security apparatus. The tech oligarchs, the media moguls. They saw the writing on the wall early and moved quietly. But now, the exodus has expanded. Even oligarchs with deep connections to energy, to defense contracts, to industries utterly dependent on state favor, are making moves. Financial intelligence firms report massive capital outflows. An estimated $40 billion fled Russia in the final quarter of 2024 alone. That is capital leaving at a rate of nearly $500 million per day. This is not just oligarchs moving money. This is everyone with resources, with connections, converting rubles to dollars and transferring funds to Turkey, Georgia, Kazakhstan, anywhere but Russia. From a strategic standpoint, this is devastating for the Kremlin. Dictatorships rely on elite loyalty. Without that loyalty, without the belief that proximity to power brings security, the entire system fractures. And history shows that once elite defection begins, it accelerates. Fear is contagious. Once a few oligarchs flee, others question their own positions. The exodus becomes a stampede. For months, the images have been haunting, not of battlefields, but of economic destruction. Bank runs, currency devaluation, supply chain breakdowns. The Russian economy, once touted as resilient, as insulated by energy exports and gold reserves, is now showing signs of systemic failure. And yet, the most telling indicator is capital flight. billions upon billions of dollars, quietly leaving Russia and never coming back. Think about that. Capital flight is not just an economic term. It is a vote of no confidence. When money leaves a country en masse, it signals that those with the most to lose no longer believe in that country's future. Russia has seen an estimated $150 billion leave since February 2022. Here's the third hook. The pace has accelerated dramatically. In the final quarter of 2024 alone, $40 billion fled. The ruble has lost nearly 40% of its value against the dollar since the war began. Inflation officially stands at 15%, but independent analysts suggest closer to 25% for basic goods. Interest rates have been hiked to try stabilizing currency, but that only strangles businesses and consumers. What's truly extraordinary is how deliberate the oligarchs have been. These are not panic moves made in ignorance. These are calculated strategies executed by people with access to the best financial advisors money can buy. They saw this coming. They prepared. And now they are executing their exit strategies while ordinary Russians suffer the consequences. The human cost is staggering. Pensioners watching savings disappear. Families struggling to afford necessities. Young people seeing futures evaporate. And yet, the oligarchs are safely offshore, their wealth protected, their families comfortable. The injustice is breathtaking. But here's where it gets even more haunting. The capital flight is not just about wealth preservation. It is preparation for regime change. Oligarchs are not just moving money. They are positioning themselves for post-Putin Russia, ensuring that when the regime collapses, when chaos erupts, they will be positioned to return, to reclaim influence, perhaps even shape the new order. From a geopolitical standpoint, this economic implosion is disaster for Putin. Dictators rely on economic stability to maintain legitimacy. When the economy collapses, when ordinary people suffer while the elite flee, the social contract fractures. People begin to question. They begin to resist. We have seen this before. In the final years of the Soviet Union, capital flight accelerated as insiders recognized the system was unsustainable. Communist Party elites quietly moved assets abroad. By the time collapse came in 1991, many had already positioned themselves to profit from transition. The same pattern is playing out now. This is not just crisis. It is moral crisis. The system Putin built, designed to enrich a small elite while suppressing everyone else, is cannibalizing itself. There are moments when symbolism becomes more powerful than any weapon. The oligarchs fleeing Russia is one of those moments. But what makes it even more extraordinary is how the Kremlin has responded. Not with reassurance, not with confidence, but with paranoia, with purges, with the kind of internal terror that signals a regime in its death throes. In the past 6 months, reports have surfaced of high-ranking officials being arrested without warning, often without clear charges. General Sergei Surovikin, once celebrated for tactical innovations, disappeared from public view in October. Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov was arrested in April on corruption charges. Oligarchs who remained in Russia have found themselves under investigation, their assets frozen, their movements restricted. This is not governance. This is paranoia. And paranoia, history teaches us, is the final stage before collapse. For decades, Putin maintained control through careful balance of reward and punishment. Loyalty was rewarded with wealth. Disloyalty was punished swiftly. But the system worked because there was predictability. As long as you stayed loyal, you were safe. And yet, now, that predictability has evaporated. Loyalty is no longer enough. Because in a regime that is failing, everyone becomes a potential scapegoat. When a dictator becomes paranoid, when he begins seeing enemies everywhere, when he starts purging his own inner circle, it is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of desperation. Here's the fourth hook. Imagine being an oligarch in Moscow right now. You have spent decades building your fortune through proximity to Putin. You believed your loyalty would protect you, but now you watch as colleagues disappear. You hear whispers of investigations. You receive late-night phone calls warning your name has come up in meetings. The protection you thought you had is gone. This is psychological warfare Putin is waging against his own elite. It is deliberate, calculated, designed to keep everyone off balance, to prevent coordinated opposition. But here is the problem with fear as governing strategy. It works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, When fear becomes so overwhelming that people would rather flee than obey, the system collapses. Intelligence reports from Western agencies paint a chilling picture. Meetings inside the Kremlin are tense, filled with silence and suspicion. Officials are afraid to speak candidly, afraid to offer dissenting opinions. Putin himself, according to sources, has become increasingly isolated, relying on a shrinking group of advisors too terrified to tell him truth. This is not the behavior of a leader in control. This is behavior of a leader who knows he is losing control and is desperately trying to hold on through fear. The purges, the arrests, the investigations are not signs of strength. They are signs of panic. We have seen this before. Stalin's purges in the 1930s, Saddam Hussein's paranoia in final years, Nicolae Ceausescu's isolation before the Romanian Revolution. The pattern is always the same. The dictator becomes paranoid. The inner circle shrinks. Fear, rather than uniting the regime, begins to fracture it. And fragmented regimes do not survive. In modern warfare, the supply chain is the heartbeat of any army. Without fuel, without ammunition, without food, even the most powerful military becomes paralyzed. And yet, what we are witnessing in Russia is not just battlefield failure. It is systemic supply chain collapse. The infrastructure of war is crumbling. Reports from the front lines reveal the impact. Russian soldiers running low on ammunition, artillery shells being rationed, fuel shortages forcing units to abandon equipment, medical supplies scarce, even basic necessities like food and winter clothing becoming harder to secure. This is not just logistical challenge, it is systemic failure. Here's the fifth hook. The supply chain is not just about moving goods. It is about coordination, about trust, about systems that function predictably. And when those systems break down, when the people managing them flee or are arrested, when paranoia replaces coordination, everything falls apart. Western intelligence agencies have tracked this collapse closely. According to classified assessments, Russian military logistics have deteriorated significantly in the past 6 months. Sanctions made importing critical components harder. Corruption siphoned off resources. And most critically, the exodus of oligarchs disrupted the informal networks that kept the system functioning. Because here is the truth about authoritarian systems. They rely heavily on informal relationships, on personal connections, on networks of loyalty operating outside official channels. When those networks fracture, when the people who manage them flee, the entire system becomes brittle. And brittle systems do not weaken gradually, they shatter. The supply chain collapse is also psychological. Soldiers on front lines are losing confidence in their leadership. They are seeing that promises of support, of reinforcement, of proper equipment are not being kept. And when soldiers lose confidence, morale collapses. And collapsed morale leads to collapsed armies. Satellite imagery shows abandoned equipment on battlefields. Intercepted communications reveal soldiers complaining about shortages. Ukrainian forces report capturing Russian positions where ammunition stores are nearly empty. This is not the Russian military that invaded in February 2022. This is a force that is exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly desperate. The oligarchs fleeing Russia understood this. They saw that the system, the networks they helped build, were no longer sustainable. And rather than stay and be blamed for collapse, they fled. Something deeper than regime collapse is unfolding. Something that cannot be measured in arrests or capital flight. It is a shift in perception, in credibility, in the fundamental assumptions that have defined geopolitics for decades. For nearly a quarter century, Putin's Russia was seen as formidable power. But now, that perception is crumbling. When oligarchs began fleeing Russia in unprecedented numbers, when the inner circle started fracturing, the international community took notice, not with alarm, with calculation. Because regime collapse in a nuclear power is not just a domestic issue, it is global crisis. And every nation with interests in the region is now positioning itself for what comes next. Here's the sixth hook. This isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a complete recalibration of global power dynamics. The oligarchs fleeing, the regime collapsing, the economy imploding, all signal to the world that the era of Russian dominance is over. Western capitals feel this shift. In Washington, Brussels, London, conversations are no longer about containing Russia. They are about preparing for post-Putin Russia. Who will fill the power vacuum? How will nuclear weapons be secured? What role will China play? These are not hypothetical questions. They are urgent strategic priorities. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, many expected the West to fracture. Instead, the opposite happened. NATO unity strengthened. European resolve hardened. The United States provided unprecedented support. And as war dragged on, as Russia's weaknesses became undeniable, that unity only deepened. The oligarchs fleeing have accelerated that unity. Their exodus is evidence that even Russia's elite no longer believe in the regime's future, evidence that the system is unsustainable, evidence that the West's strategy of sanctions, support for Ukraine, and strategic patience is working. The European Union, once dependent on Russian energy, has successfully diversified. New pipelines from Norway, liquefied natural gas from United States and Qatar, renewable energy investments. The transition was painful and expensive, but it worked. And now, as Russia's economy collapses, the EU is no longer vulnerable. China, Russia's most significant partner, is watching closely. Beijing has maintained its relationship with Moscow, providing economic support. But China is pragmatic. It does not support lost causes. And as Russia's collapse becomes undeniable, China is recalculating. It is positioning itself not as Russia's savior, but as the power that will fill the vacuum Russia leaves behind. The global implications are clear. The era of Russian dominance is over. When the engines go quiet, when the headlines fade, and the images of fleeing oligarchs stop filling our screens, what remains is a truth that cannot be buried. Freedom fights back. You can suppress a people, you can occupy their cities, but you can never own their will to resist. And you can build an empire on fear, on corruption, on the illusion of permanence, but you cannot stop that empire from collapsing when the foundation rots from within. Putin's regime is falling apart not because of external pressure alone. It is falling apart because the system he built was unsustainable. The oligarchs, the inner circle, the elite class that enriched themselves through proximity to power are now fleeing that power. And in fleeing, they are confirming what many suspected, but few had evidence to prove. The regime is finished. This war, as brutal as it has been, has exposed something extraordinary. Ukraine has become more than a nation defending its borders. It has become a symbol of resilience, a symbol of courage, a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to tyranny. And as the world watched, as Ukraine held firm while Russia collapsed inward, the symbolism became undeniable. And that's what makes this so powerful. The mother who sends her son to war not for conquest but for survival. The soldier who fights not for medals but for home. The journalist who risks everything to tell truth. These are the real warriors of freedom. The ones who remind us that courage is not loud, it is quiet, it is the refusal to give up. When Putin's oligarchs started fleeing, when billionaires who built fortunes on corruption began boarding planes in dead of night, it was not just an economic story. It was a moral story. A story about systems built on greed, on fear, on exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few. And those systems, history teaches us, always collapse. Always. Because they are hollow. The lesson is as old as strategy itself. Power without legitimacy is temporary. Wealth without accountability is fragile. And regimes built on fear eventually turn that fear inward, devouring themselves. The oligarchs understood this. That is why they fled. But if there's one thing the collapse of Putin's regime has taught us, it's this. The real power lies not with the oligarchs, not with the dictators, not with those who hoard wealth and wield fear. The real power lies with the people who resist. With the nations that refuse to bow. With ordinary citizens who, despite everything, still believe in freedom, in dignity, in the possibility of a better future. Ukraine has shown us that. It has shown the world that courage matters. That moral authority matters, that resilience, both military and societal, can outlast brutality. And as Russia collapses, as oligarchs flee, as the regime fractures, the contrast could not be clearer. One nation built its future on fear and corruption. The other built its future on courage and transparency. And the one built on courage is still standing. So tonight, as private jets continue leaving Moscow, as yachts disappear into international waters, as the elite class abandons the regime they once supported, perhaps the most haunting truth is this. The collapse was inevitable. The oligarchs knew it. The insiders knew it. And now, as the world watches, everyone knows it. You can build an empire on lies, but you cannot sustain it. You can suppress freedom, but you cannot extinguish it. And you can terrorize your own people, but you cannot make them loyal. Putin's regime is falling apart because it was always going to fall apart. Systems built on fear do not last. Empires built on corruption do not endure. The oligarchs fleeing Russia are not just abandoning a sinking ship. They are confirming the ship was never seaworthy. It was always doomed. It was simply a matter of time before the rot became undeniable. And that time is now. And yet, amidst the collapse, amidst the chaos, there is hope. Because the fall of one regime is the birth of possibility. The end of tyranny is the beginning of freedom. And as Russia collapses, as the elite flee, as the system fractures beyond repair, the world is reminded of a timeless truth. Freedom has a way of finding its way back into the light. And when it does, it illuminates everything the darkness tried to hide. And that's where we leave it tonight. An empire collapsing, oligarchs fleeing, and a world that finally is seeing the truth. You can dim the lights, but you can't dim the truth. You can destroy buildings, but not the spirit of those who rebuild them. And you can silence voices, but not the will of a nation that refuses to die quietly. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.